This is the Topping A90. This is a super popular amp right now for a few reasons, the biggest of which is that it measures, along with its little brother, the L30, amazingly. It sits right at the top of Audio Science Review's performance charts, and not just with full-scale stuff. It does really well with low-level signals as well, which is something which the designer was quite eager, and rightly so, to point out. It also has a high-res audio sticker. Now, we could just stop the review there, but for the sake of integrity, I'm going to talk about it a bit more. The build is fantastic. It's all one solid piece of metal, other than the front plate. Everything about it feels really, really solid and really good. Even just small stuff like those switches. Oh my god. Super satisfying. Having an off switch on the front. Thank you. Shit, please, listen, do that. Thanks. And the pot's great as well. Pot feels really, really smooth. It's dead silent. The Magnus pot, for example, is a lot stiffer and you can actually hear it as well, whereas this is just dead smooth and silent. A little nitpick in that it's got a little bit of wiggle, just a touch where there's no resistance before it starts turning, but other than that, it's fantastic. The build is really, really nice. It's clean, it's sleek, it'll stack nicely. It's not some weird trapezoid shape like the SP200 was. It's good. One other thing I really like is that this isn't just suitable for people wanting to run full-size headphones at their desk. It also has Pentacon. Now, Pentacon's good because if you're wanting to run Iems or something like that, without having to run a big chunky adapter, that's fantastic. Speaking of Iems, let's talk about that first. It can run Iems perfectly. In fact, this has a really wide range of stuff that it can run. These are the Ambient Acoustics MAD 24. These are a fairly sensitive 24 BA IEM. They are $3,500 and they are fantastic. I've actually got a review of these up, which you can see if you are a patron of mine. I'm not going to publish the review just yet, just because this unit is almost suspiciously good, and I want to make sure that the final production version is just as good as this unit here. But if we stick this onto medium gain, plug that in, and just go from this song where we were before. First thing to note, with the pot all the way down, even on low gain, I can still hear a little bit. Not much, but it's there. If I crank the pot up on low gain, nothing. If I've got a high gain, I'm getting hiss about here. Medium gain, you can hear it, but you really do have to crank the pot up. So there will be a little bit of hiss if you've got something like Andromeda's, but not before you get to where you need to be for listening volume. So noise floor isn't an issue on this. And it sounds great. So it can drive IEMs with no problem whatsoever, and a lot of IEMs will have a balanced 4.4 connector as well. It can also drive pretty hard to drive Planars. These are the Arias, but what I was really surprised was how well this handles Susvara. The Susvara is just about the hardest headphone you can get to drive, with the possible exception of the HE6. It needs a speaker amp, basically, to sound its best, and this headphone amp is one of the best headphone amps I've tried with the Susvara. In terms of tonality and signature overall, which I'll get into in a sec, there's definitely ones I prefer, but in terms of the actual ability to drive these headphones and actually have the low end sound fast and correct, which these only really do when you put them with a lot of power, this does a really good job. This does better than the HPA4, this does better than a GSX Mini, and that's not just me. There's a few people I know who've actually tried Susvara and 1266 on the A90 versus a couple other different amps, and this seems to, regardless of what you think of the signature, in terms of power and the ability to deliver enough current to properly drive stuff like the Susvara, it's pretty fantastic. So, let's talk about the build a little bit more, and actually, let's have a look at the internals. So, on the back, we've got standard internal power supply, which is nice, XLR and RCA inputs and outputs, because it's got a preamp. Let's have a look what's inside. Normally, at this part in the video, I would try and take the product apart and show you the internals. Unfortunately, I've not been able to do it this time because Topping has seen fit to make it impossible for the normal person to open. I've got this far, and then it will not budge. I cannot get the cover off. It seems like there is a screw on the other side of the front panel, which you have to have a really long, thin screwdriver to get to. So, unfortunately, I've not been able to take it apart, but I do have some photos of the PCB. On the screen, you can see the PCB. The first thing you'll notice is it's got a big, beefy switch mode power supply. It would have been nice to see a linear power supply, because linear power supplies, even though they're more expensive and less efficient, generate less noise and less ripple than switch mode power supplies. But keeping things compact, keeping things low cost, the switch mode power supply is beneficial there. Plus, given how good the measured performance is, there's not really much you can complain about. Also, the fact that this drives hungry planars so well, meaning the current capability and the actual power delivery is so good, the power supply likely has a lot to do with that. So I've got no complaints there at all. The next thing you can see is it's got a big heatsink under which there are 4 Texas Instruments 6120A2 op-amps. Now, we've seen these before. These op-amps are also in the L30, they are also in the Magnus, and they are also in some other products you might know, like the Sennheiser HD-VD820, for example, and HD-VD800 as well, I think. It has the same op-amps, but it does not sound the same, and that's because it's doing a few things different. There's a lot more circuitry going on around the op-amps than there is in the Magnus, for example, as you can see. There's twice as many. It's likely using some kind of a different nested feedback design, which obviously Topping's not going to give full details about exactly how their amp is working, but you can tell quite a bit from the PCB. It's clearly different from how the Magnus is set up, and it sounds very different too. Additionally, the fact that it's got a big fat heatsink on it, and that this unit runs fairly toasty, whereas the Magnus and the 789 run really cool, suggests that those op-amps are biased further into Class A than on the Magnus or 789. I don't actually know what op-amps the 789 is using, so don't quote me on that, but the Magnus is definitely using the same op-amps. So it's likely that they're biased further into Class A. That's about it. It's a fairly simple amp design, but it's doing a good job. So let's put this back together and talk some more. So, you might have noticed in the intro that I was using a XLR to single-ended adapter, and that's because I was testing the single-ended on the A90 versus the L30, and that's because a lot of people are going to be wanting to know, hey, I have an L30 already, is it worth getting an A90 as an upgrade? The short answer there is no. These sound on single-ended absolutely identical, the power is basically the same. There is, as far as I can hear, no reason whatsoever to get an A90 if you are just using single-ended stuff. So if I continue on, let's go medium gain on both, where we were. And then we switch over to L30. It sounds the same. Obviously, I'm not able to quick switch AB. I don't have a switch box which comes after the amp at the moment. I'm looking to get one though. But from switching back and forth, I cannot tell a difference. There is a difference between this and something like the JDS Atom. The JDS Atom definitely sounds different. The Atom's actually a little bit warmer than this and the L30. So I slightly prefer the Atom to the L30. But then the A90 is definitely better if you have balanced headphones. This is also only 1 watt, whereas that's 3. So something like an Aria definitely doesn't do as well on this. If you have dynamic headphones, though, then this might be a better choice than the L30 as a budget amp. So, balanced then. What is the difference between balanced and single-ended? Well, if you have something like an HD800 or an easier-to-drive can like LCDX, probably not that much. There's not really going to be many headphones for which you need the full 6 watts, or where that extra power is actually going to be of any benefit. But harder to drive planars like this really do love power. These scale to the point where if you put them on a speaker amp, you get a little bit more out of them. Nowhere near as much as something like a Susvara. Susvara on a normal headphone amp. In fact, one of the most stark contrasts was this on the 789 versus this on the A90, even though they're both 6 watts. It's night and day. This just does so much more in the low end. It's so much faster. It doesn't feel anywhere near as limp. And then when you go up to a speaker amp, it's another level. It's great on this, and it's just a notch better on that. So let's try single-ended. And then if we go to balanced. It's not night and day. It's not like it's a massive difference, but there is something there. It's just a little bit faster in the low end. It's a little bit weightier. It just feels a little bit more controlled. And there's a few instances where you get a little bit better soundstage as well. This is specific to planars, though. Planars just seem to love power. I don't really know why. whereas dynamic cans, like the HD800, it sounds identical if you use balanced or single-ended. Doesn't matter which you use. So, how does this amp actually sound? Well, if I had an arbitrary scale where 0 was super thick and warm and 10 was hyperclinical, the 789 from THX would be about an 8. This would be a 6.5, maybe a 7, depending on what you connected it to. It's definitely a slightly brighter leaning amp, it's definitely a little bit clinical, but it doesn't have that same level of op-amp glare or feedback aggression that something like the Magnus does, or the 789. I find this a lot less fatiguing than the Magnus, even though the Magnus is actually it's more compressed and it's almost a darker presentation. But this is a lot smoother. This doesn't have the same sibilance issues. I wouldn't pair this with a bright DAC. This with the SU8 V2 or the Motu M2. The Motu M2 and the SU8 V2 sounded identical to me. That's not a good pairing. It's bright, it's not fun, it's just not good to listen to. The SGD1 from Soncos, that's also an ESS DAC. It's also a slightly brighter DAC. It's a lot smoother though. It doesn't have that same aggression issue. It's okay, it works with this. I actually preferred the Modius though. I prefer the SGD1 as a DAC. That's a better DAC than the Modius for sure. But with this specific pairing, a slightly warmer DAC like the Modius does do a good job. And something like a Bifrost 2 with this would be, yes. Oh. So definitely consider what DAC you're pairing with this. I wouldn't pick something overly clinical, else you're not going to have a particularly good time. So, Sibilance then, let's talk about that, because that's one of the big problems with a lot of the feedback-based amps. That's one of the issues I had with the 789, is it just any kind of sibilance being present at all, you wouldn't be able to ignore it. This doesn't quite have that problem. The track I use as a sibilance barometer is Something Good Can Work by Two Door Cinema Club. I have a two-stage test for testing sibilance. First, you play this song. If this song sounds sibilant on your gear, it's because your gear is sibilant. If it doesn't sound sibilant, then either that means your gear isn't sibilant and it's doing a good job, or it means it's smoothing it over too much, at which point you move on to part 2. So let's just play this. Skip to vocals. There's just a touch, but just a touch. It's not intrusive, it's not painful or anything, but you can hear it's there. For the sake of completion, let's talk about the second part of this. More Than You Know by Axwell and Grosso. This is the second part. If your amp or your chain or whatever doesn't sound sibilant on the first track, then play this. This track should sound sibilant, and if it doesn't, your gear is smoothing things over too much. See how far I can get through. Nope, I can't. That's just chest. Fuck that. This song is really sibilant, and if it doesn't sound sibilant on your chain, then your chain is just smoothing things over too much. So that's the second part of that test. So this is a slightly sibilant amp. It's definitely slightly clinical, but it's nowhere near as bad as a 789 or even a Magnus, although the Magnus is definitely a slightly darker presentation. So how does this do in terms of detail? Well, the answer is very well. This is a very resolving amp, and the separation is really good as well. So let's pick something. Movement by Jose. This is good. You can hear every element that's going on. Everything is very separate. It doesn't feel like anything's claustrophobic or invading on each other's space. There's some less resolving amps where, particularly when you've got low-end stuff like that, there is a lot of low-end energy going on here. That can sometimes encroach and make it difficult to pick out the subtle stuff. This doesn't have that problem. This keeps everything very separate. It's very resolving. But sometimes things do sound a little bit dry. It does sound just a touch thin. Detail is good. Timbre is just okay. And obviously, this is a $500 amp, so you're not expecting Bass Labs level timbre or anything like that. It's good. It's not bad, but it could be better. Let's stick with the same track and just talk about the vocals. They're just a touch thin. If I swap to the AHP2 without dropping that cable, preferably. There's quite a bit more fullness to the sound on the AHP2 than there is on the A90. If I'm A-Bing them, that's fairly noticeable. If you just had an A90 on your desk, it wouldn't be a problem. This isn't something which I'm picking on because I think it's an issue, because I think you're not going to enjoy the amp because of that. It's just something to note. I'm reviewing this amp and I have to nitpick a little bit. I think this is a very resolving amp. I think this is very detailed. Staging is actually quite a good point. That's one of the issues I had. The 789, the staging was always just a little bit flat. If you did the max pot trick, it got a lot better. The Magnus staging is all the time. The staging on this is pretty good. Let's pick something big. Let's go... What's big here? Silver Soul by Zolablood. This track sounds appropriately huge, so the soundstage on this is good, and obviously the headphones are always going to make the biggest difference in terms of soundstage, which the Arias do a really good job on. Soundstage is great, detail is great, timbre is just okay, separation is really good. The main issue I have with this amp is that it's just a bit dry at times. Again, it's nowhere near as bad as the 789, but it does come across thin sometimes, and if you are the kind of person that is sensitive to treble, or the kind of person who prefers a much warmer presentation, this might not be the best amp for you. If you are the kind of person who enjoys just getting every last ounce of detail, every last ounce of resolution, then this is going to be great. This is fantastic. One of the things which I have to talk about again is low end with Planars on this amp is really, really nice. Planars, their low end changes quite a bit depending on what amp you plug them into. It's one of the reasons I love the HP2, because it's the equivalent of 25 watts at 32 ohms. So anything you plug into it, even Susvara, is just snappy and effortless. This does a really good job. So Arias on this, let's pick something Bonafide. That's a good one. Emotional Oranges. These guys are great. That is just punchy and fast and full. It's fantastic. If I were to swap to the Cavalli Tube, obviously the Cavalli Tube Hybrid and this aren't direct competitors. They're very different amps and you wouldn't buy them. This isn't a better or worse question, but just for the sake of demonstration. On this amp, this track... It's still good, it's still fine, but it's nowhere near as impactful. This, the low end with Planars on this, if you have Arias, it's worth just trying to get a demo of this, because this does so much better than the 789, does so much better than the L30, does so much better than the Magnus even, although the Magnus isn't bad in terms of power, actually. I'll give it that. It's fantastic. Power handling, especially of harder to drive Planars, is perfect. So where does that leave us then? Well, I think this is a fantastic amp for the money. There is going to be a better amp for whatever given headphones you choose. If you've got HD800 or LCDX like a warmer amp. Those go really good with the JDS Atom or the Cavalli Tube Hybrid or something like that. But the complete package that this offers, all the feature set, having a preamp integrated, having Pentacon so that you can use balanced Iems as well as XLR, and on the state of Iems, having a noise floor low enough to drive Iems, whilst also having enough power to actually pretty properly drive Susvara in a single amp. That's fantastic. The gain control as well, the ability to go from on high gain with this track. I'm about there. If I go to low gain, I'm about there. So you get this massive range of the pot, actual proper gain control. There's a lot of amps where, you'll be there and then you switch the gain and you're there. You might as well not have the switch. It's kind of stupid. Single-ended actually sounds good. There are other amps like the Magnius, where the single-ended is nowhere near as good as balanced, to the point where I wouldn't buy this if you had single-ended. So you might as well just use that as a balanced amp. Having single-ended that sounds good, having balanced that sounds good, having a nice preamp, which doesn't sound as amazing, but it's fine, having proper gain control, having a low noise floor, having tons of power, having great resolution, good soundstage, a nice build. There's very little more that you can ask for. The only real thing that I would like this amp to do differently is if it was just a touch less clinical. That's it. But it's not sibilant, it's not aggressive in the same way that 789 is. It's great. And if you are looking at this amp, I think this is a fantastic option for almost any headphones. The only thing I would say is do not pair this with a bright or clinical DAC. Do not buy this if you have an SU8V2. Get something warmer to start. Get a Modius, that's $200, that works really well. Get a Bifrost 2, get something like that. Other than that, this is a fantastic product, and it's got my full recommendation. A huge thank you to Talbot Hound for sending this in for review. He's actually sent me a few bits and bobs. SGD1, Modi Multibit, and a few other nice things. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to my patrons, Chris, King Jong-un, Ross Kyle, Daniel Mellinger, and Lana Bennett for supporting me, making all this happen. All of the money that I get from Patreon is going straight back into buying audio stuff. I never use affiliate links. I like to keep everything as unbiased and unaffiliated as possible. Everything is through Patreon, and all the money from that goes straight into buying audio stuff to review. So thank you very much to everyone who's supporting me. Until next time, have a nice day.